I wasn't sitting when my grandfather's will was read. I was standing against the wall, half hidden behind a row of chairs like a staff member who'd overstayed her welcome. No one told me to stand there. They didn't have to. The room was full of people dressed in black, but there was nothing somber about them. The grief had already passed, or maybe it had never arrived at all. What filled the space instead was anticipation, sharp, hungry, almost electric. My grandfather had been buried that morning. By afternoon, his family had gathered to divide what was left of him. My father sat in the front row, spine-straight hands, folded like he was about to attend a board meeting. He glanced at his watch twice before the lawyer even began. My stepmother sat beside him, composed, elegant, wiping at the corners of her eyes without disturbing her makeup. My brother leaned back, arms crossed, calm in the way only people who expect to win can be. They all looked like heirs. And then there was me, Linda, the assistant, the girl who spent her days at my grandfather's side, answering his calls, organizing his papers, making sure his life ran smoothly while everyone else lived far away, and remembered him only when it was convenient. I had known long before that day that I didn't belong in their circle, but I hadn't expected to be reminded so publicly. The lawyer began reading. His voice was steady, practiced, careful with every word. He named companies first, then properties, then investments. Each name was followed by a pause just long enough for the room to breathe it in, just long enough for someone to smile. No one interrupted. No one questioned. They nodded. They exchanged glances. They counted silently. Not once did anyone speak my grandfather's name with affection. To them, he wasn't a man who had lived. He was a vault that had finally been opened. When my father's name was read, he exhaled, slowly, satisfied. When my stepmother's followed, she smiled for the first time that day. When my brother's inheritance was announced, he didn't even bother hiding his grin. Then the lawyer stopped. He looked up. Linda. The room shifted, not with interest, with surprise, like someone had just mentioned a detail they'd forgotten to erase. To Linda, the lawyer said, glancing back at the document, who worked closely with Mr. Robert Hale for many years. A quiet laugh rippled through the room. Mr. Hale leaves an envelope, the lawyer continued, and a first-class plane ticket to Switzerland. Silence, then laughter. Not nervous, not uncomfortable, real laughter. My stepmother turned to the woman beside her and said loud enough for others to hear, "Well, I suppose even assistants deserve a goodbye gift." Someone else murmured, "Guess loyalty has a limit." My brother looked over his shoulder at me, amused. "At least it's first class," he said. "That's generous." My father didn't laugh. He nodded, as if this outcome made perfect sense, as if it confirmed what he had always believed, that I was useful, but never important. I stood there holding the envelope, my fingers stiff around its edges. I didn't open it. I didn't say a word. Not because I was strong, but because something colder had settled inside me. The kind of cold that comes when you finally understand how small you are in other people's eyes. The humiliation didn't stay in that room. By evening it had a headline, then another, business pages, online news. Even entertainment outlets picked it up, spinning it into something almost funny. Family inherits millions, assistant gets plane ticket. Forgotten favorite. Did the tycoon draw a clear line between family and staff? My name was mentioned, but only as a detail. A curiosity, a punchline. One article wrote, "Perhaps Mr. Hale understood exactly who deserved his fortune." I read every word, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed everything I had spent years trying to ignore. That night I sat alone in my apartment. The envelope lay unopened on the table, the ticket beside it. I thought about the years I'd spent beside my grandfather, The meetings I'd attended quietly. The advice he'd asked for, then pretended he hadn't needed. I remembered something he once told me late one night when everyone else had already left. People will decide your worth long before they know your value, he'd said. Let them. At the time, I hadn't understood. That night, I did. The next morning, I boarded the plane. Not with hope, not with expectation, just with the certainty that staying would have crushed what little was left of me. I didn't know yet what waited on the other side of that flight. But I knew one thing. Switzerland was never meant to be an escape. I wasn't born into the role they assigned me. I was trained into it. From the time I was old enough to understand conversations but young enough to be ignored, I learned where I stood in that family. My father's children were the future, the bloodline, the continuation. I was the leftover useful quiet and easily overlooked. I wasn't raised with expectations. I was raised with instructions. Be helpful, be grateful, don't take up space. When my grandfather started asking me to accompany him to meetings, my father didn't object. He smiled the way people do when something benefits them without threatening them. To him, I wasn't being included. I was being used. She's good at organizing, he told people. She listens. She doesn't get in the way. No one asked whether I wanted more. My stepmother liked to remind me often and publicly that I should be thankful. You're lucky, she'd say at family dinners. Most girls would kill to be so close to a man like your grandfather. She never meant it as praise. It was a warning. My brother treated me like furniture. Always there, never important. If I spoke during meals, he talked over me. If I offered an opinion, he rolled his eyes. You're just his assistant, he'd say. Relax. At first, I believed them. I told myself proximity was enough. That learning by watching mattered. That maybe one day they'd see what I could do. But the closer I worked with my grandfather, the more complicated things became. He didn't treat me like help. He asked questions. He listened. He challenged me. At night when the office was empty, he'd slide papers across the desk and ask what I thought. Not politely, seriously. What's missing? What would you change? Who's lying to me here? I learned to read people before I learned to read contracts. I learned to hear hesitation in voices, to spot panic behind confidence. I learned when silence mattered more than speaking. And slowly, without realizing it, I became dangerous. The family noticed before I did. My stepmother started hovering during meetings, standing too close, interrupting too often. She'd laugh and say, "Don't work her too hard, Robert. She's just helping. Just helping." My father began asking questions not to me but about me. Why is she always there? What exactly does she do for you? Isn't that a bit much responsibility? My brother was worse. He mocked me openly. Careful, he'd say at parties, clinking his glass. Linda might take notes on you. People laughed. I learned to smile and say nothing. That silence saved me more than once. Because while they were busy dismissing me, I was watching them fail. I saw the businesses my father ran into the ground with arrogance and shortcuts. I saw my brother burn through opportunities he didn't understand, convinced his last name would save him. I saw my stepmother insert herself where she didn't belong, trading charm for influence she never earned. And I saw my grandfather notice. He never corrected them. He never defended me. He just watched. One night after a particularly tense dinner, he asked me to stay behind. We sat in his study, the house quiet around us. He poured himself a drink and leaned back in his chair, eyes tired but sharp. "They don't see you," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," I replied. "Good," he said after a moment. "Then you're still free." I didn't understand what he meant. Not then. As the years passed, my role became more defined and more invisible. I was present at everything but credited for nothing. If a deal went well, it was my grandfather's genius. If something stalled, I was blamed quietly, indirectly. She must have missed something, my stepmother would say. She's not trained for this level, my father agreed. My grandfather never corrected them. Instead, he gave me more access, more responsibility, more silence. By the time his health began to decline, I was running his schedule, his communications, and half his operations. He trusted me with things he wouldn't put in writing: names, numbers, intentions. And still, to the family, I was nothing more than a girl who fetched files. When he died, they assumed I would disappear with him. They thought the will would erase me. That assumption felt safe to them, comfortable, necessary. Because if they admitted I mattered, if they admitted I'd been more than an assistant, then they'd have to face an uncomfortable truth: that they'd underestimated me. And people like my family didn't survive by admitting mistakes. They survived by rewriting reality, which is exactly what they did. After the funeral, my name became shorthand for insignificance. She didn't get anything, they told friends, just a plane ticket. Poor girl. They said it kindly, cruelly, publicly. They said it until they believed it. And in believing it, they made the same mistake my grandfather had spent years preparing me for. They thought I was finished. They had no idea I was just getting started. Switzerland was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, not peaceful, controlled, the kind of place where nothing happened by accident and no one asked questions they didn't already know the answers to. When the plane landed, I didn't feel excitement. I felt numb. The laughter from the will reading still rang in my ears, sharp and echoing like it had followed me across the ocean. I told myself this trip was meaningless, a polite dismissal, a final errand before I faded out of their lives completely. That belief lasted less than an hour. A man in a dark coat waited just beyond customs, holding a small sign with my name on it. Not just my last name, my full name, perfectly spelled. He didn't smile. He didn't explain. He simply said, "Miss Hale, this way," and took my suitcase. The car was black, quiet, immaculate. The driver never asked where I was staying. He already knew. As we moved through the city, I watched glass towers rise between old stone buildings, money layered over history. Everything felt measured, intentional, like someone had planned this long before I arrived. We stopped in front of a private building overlooking the lake. No signage, no visible branding, just steel glass and security. Inside, a woman met me at the elevator. "You're expected," she said. "They've been waiting." That word caught in my chest. Waiting. The room they led me into wasn't large, but it was intimidating in its simplicity. No artwork, no excess, just a long table, leather chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows. 3 people stood when I entered. Not lawyers, not family, executives. They didn't look curious. They looked relieved. One of them, a man with silver hair and an accent I couldn't place, extended his hand. "We've been wondering when you'd arrive," he said. "Your grandfather was very precise about the timing." I felt the room tilt. "I think there's been a mistake," I said carefully. "I'm not." He smiled gently, cutting me off. "No," he said, "there hasn't." He gestured to the chair at the head of the table. "That seat is yours." I didn't sit. Not yet. He slid a folder toward me, thick, heavy, filled with documents I recognized before I understood them. Company names, holding structures, trust arrangements. My name was everywhere. Not as an employee, not as a beneficiary, as an owner. As I turned the pages, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier. Each document revealed another layer, another piece of something massive that had been built quietly, deliberately, without anyone noticing. Casinos, hotels, shipping interests, private equity funds, not scattered investments. An empire. One of the women spoke next. Your grandfather began consolidating assets over 20 years ago, she said. Many of them were placed under entities designed specifically for long-term transition. Transition to whom, I asked. She met my eyes. To you. I couldn't speak. The silver-haired man continued, his voice calm, almost respectful. He didn't trust publicity. He didn't trust noise. And he didn't trust your family. The words landed harder than any insult I'd heard back home. He trusted you because you watched, the man said. You listened, you learned, you never rushed him. That mattered. I thought of all the nights in his study, all the questions he'd asked, all the answers he'd never corrected. He hadn't been teaching me by accident. He didn't want you discovered too early, the woman added. He was very clear about that. Power attracts the wrong kind of attention. He wanted you prepared before anyone realized what you held. My hands were shaking now. How much I asked. The man paused. Then he told me. The number didn't feel real. It didn't register as wealth. It registered as scale, as reach, as something far larger than money. I felt suddenly small, and then just as suddenly grounded. This wasn't luck. This was planning. Why the ticket? I asked quietly. The man smiled again. Because Switzerland is where the truth lives, he said. And because he knew you'd come alone. They gave me time, not explanations. Time. Hours passed as I reviewed documents, agreements, structures so complex they made my father's businesses look like hobbies. Every signature traced back decades, every move layered with intent. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was careless. At some point, I stopped feeling shocked. I started feeling angry, not at my grandfather, at the people who laughed, at the people who assumed proximity meant incompetence, who saw silence as weakness, who confused humility with irrelevance. They had divided what they could see. They had no idea what had been built beyond their reach. That evening, standing alone on a balcony overlooking the lake, I finally opened the envelope. Inside wasn't a letter. It was a single sentence written in my grandfather's unmistakable hand. They will underestimate you. Let them. I folded the paper slowly. For the first time since his death, I smiled. Not because I had inherited something vast, but because I finally understood what he had really given me. Time and silence. Power doesn't announce itself. It settles. The days after that first meeting blurred together, not because there was too much happening, but because everything was finally happening in the right order. No rush, no spectacle, just weight, quiet, undeniable weight pressing in from all sides. They didn't celebrate me, they didn't flatter me, they oriented me. Every morning began with briefings, not summaries, deep dives, markets, holdings, liabilities, leverage. I learned where my grandfather's influence began and where it ended. I learned which companies bore his name openly and which were buried under layers of entities designed to survive scrutiny wars and family. What shocked me wasn't the size. It was the discipline. This wasn't a fortune built on risk or ego. It was an ecosystem. Every asset fed another. Losses were absorbed. Gains were redirected. Nothing existed alone. Hotels weren't just hotels. They anchored land plays. Shipping wasn't logistics. It was leverage for governments and manufacturers. Casinos weren't indulgences. They were cash engines, predictable, regulated, obedient. I'd seen my father run companies like trophies. My brother treated money like proof of worth. This was different. This was infrastructure. On the third day, they stopped explaining and started asking, "What would you do here? Which risk matters more? Who do you trust in this room?" I answered carefully at first, then honestly, then decisively. No one corrected me. No one smiled. They took notes. That was when it began to sink in. This wasn't a test. They were adjusting to me. In the evenings, I walked alone through Zurich past storefronts that sold watches worth more than houses, past men who looked at me and saw nothing special. No recognition, no deference. I liked it that way. Back home, the noise was getting louder. My name was still being used as entertainment. Opinion pieces speculated about my disappointment. Business panels joked about loyalty bonuses. A morning show host smirked and said, "At least she got a nice trip." My family didn't defend me. They didn't have to. They were enjoying the attention. My stepmother gave an interview in which she spoke fondly of my grandfather's kindness toward staff. My brother posted a photo beside a new car with the caption, "Hard work pays off." I watched it all from a distance that felt almost surgical. By the end of the first week, I was no longer reacting. I was planning. The empire wasn't fragile, but it wasn't passive either. It moved with intent, and intent required a hand at the center. For years, my grandfather had been that hand. Now it was mine. They introduced me to the people who actually made things happen. Not figureheads, operators, men and women who didn't care about my last name, only my judgment. Some were skeptical, some were cautious. None were dismissive. I learned quickly who respected competence and who tested boundaries. I learned how to end meetings without raising my voice, how to redirect aggression without confrontation. And slowly something strange happened. Problems began solving themselves. A delayed permit cleared overnight. A financing gap closed unexpectedly. A hostile partner softened. At first I thought it was coincidence. Then I thought it was momentum. Only later would I understand the truth. But at the time it felt like luck. Back home, the opposite was happening. The money my family inherited began to show cracks almost immediately. They had taken what was liquid, what was visible, what required the least patience. Properties that demanded upkeep. Businesses that demanded leadership. My father expanded too fast. My brother invested in names, not fundamentals. My stepmother spent as if stability were guaranteed. They mistook inheritance for immunity. I heard about it in fragments. A loan renegotiation here. A quiet sell-off there. Nothing dramatic enough for headlines. Yet. One afternoon, while reviewing a logistics report, I paused at a familiar name, a company my father relied on. I said nothing. I didn't interfere. Not yet. That night, standing alone in my hotel room, I felt the first flicker of something dangerous. Not greed, not revenge, but clarity. They weren't being punished. They were simply being left to their own decisions, the same way they had left me. Toward the end of the second week, a man requested a meeting. Not an assistant, not a lawyer. Him. He was older than I expected. Calm, unimpressed by titles. The kind of person who didn't need to raise his voice because people leaned in when he spoke. We talked about numbers first, then strategy, then people. He asked questions my grandfather used to ask. I didn't realize how closely they mirrored each other until later. As the meeting ended, he paused. "You know," he said almost casually, "your grandfather spoke about you often." I didn't respond. "He said you would be underestimated," the man continued, "that you would mistake silence for absence, and that one day you would realize how much had been done before you ever arrived." I held his gaze. "Why tell me this now?" I asked. He smiled just slightly. "Because you're ready to stop thinking you're alone." When he left, I sat back in my chair unsettled. For the first time since arriving, I felt the edges of the picture widen beyond what I could see. This wasn't just preparation. It was protection. By the time I returned home, I was no longer the woman who boarded that plane. I didn't announce my return. I didn't correct the narrative. I let them keep laughing. Because laughter fades. Infrastructure doesn't. I came back quietly. No press, no statements, no correction of the story that had already decided who I was. To them, I was still the girl with the plane ticket. That illusion made everything easier. My apartment was unchanged, same narrow windows, same chipped mug in the sink. I kept it that way on purpose. Power didn't need a costume, not yet. What changed was how I listened. When my father called, it wasn't to ask how I was. It was to talk, to complain, to circle his own anxiety without naming it. "Things are complicated," he said, one night, voice lowered as if someone might overhear him through the phone. "Markets are unpredictable. Partners are hesitant." I said nothing. Silence invites confession. "The banks are tightening," he continued. "They're not as flexible as they used to be." Still, I said nothing. My brother called next. Drunk, loud, defensive. "You know what's funny," he slurred. "They all thought you'd disappear. Guess we were right." I let the line stay open long enough for him to hear his own voice echo back at him. Then I hung up. News traveled faster than facts. A failed expansion here, a stalled project there, nothing catastrophic, just erosion. And through it all, I kept working. Meetings began to shift in tone. People stopped explaining basics to me. They began asking my opinion directly. When I spoke, rooms adjusted. Still, I didn't reveal anything. I wasn't hiding. I was positioning. The man I'd met in Switzerland, the one whose presence seemed to straighten entire rooms, appeared again, always briefly, always at the edges of my day. At first, I thought it was coincidence. A phone call resolved a problem that should have taken weeks. A regulatory delay vanished without explanation. A hostile bid softened, then disappeared. Each time I attributed it to momentum, to preparation, to the systems my grandfather had built. It wasn't until much later that I understood someone else had been watching, not interfering, just balancing the board. Back home, the tone toward me changed. Not respect, curiosity. My stepmother asked pointed questions disguised as concern. "You seem calmer," she said at a family gathering. "Not like someone who lost everything." I smiled politely. "I didn't lose anything," I replied. She laughed brittle. "Of course." But her eyes stayed on me longer than they used to. My father began inviting me to conversations he'd never included me in before, framing it as nostalgia, as family bonding. "What do you think?" he asked, once sliding a document toward me without thinking. I scanned it. It was poorly structured, over-leveraged, fragile. I handed it back. "I wouldn't touch it," I said. He frowned. "Why not?" "Because it assumes loyalty where there is none." He studied me for a moment, unsettled. "You sound like your grandfather," he said. I didn't respond. That night the phone rang. It was the man again. "This isn't coincidence anymore, is it?" I asked. He chuckled softly. "No," he said. "It isn't." We met the following week, not in Switzerland this time, but in a private office overlooking a river I'd crossed 1,000 times without noticing. He didn't sit behind a desk. He sat across from me, hands folded, attention complete. "I owed your grandfather a debt," he said plainly. "A significant one. For what I asked, for seeing value when no one else would," he replied, "and for doing so quietly." He told me then about a deal long ago, about a moment when my grandfather had stepped in not for profit, but for principle. How that decision had changed the trajectory of an entire industry. He asked me for one thing in return, the man said, that when the time came I'd make sure you weren't crushed before you understood your own weight. I felt something tighten in my chest. "You interfered," I said. "I removed obstacles," he corrected. "There's a difference. I absorbed that." "Why now?" I asked. "Because you don't need protection anymore," he said. "You need partnership. He didn't flatter me. He didn't promise. He offered collaboration. And for the first time, I realized something unsettling. I wasn't being helped out of obligation. I was being chosen. When I declined politely, carefully, he didn't press. "Good," he said. "That means you're thinking." Weeks passed. My family's situation worsened. The empire they'd inherited began to crumble under its own arrogance. One by one, they sold pieces off. Quietly, desperately. My brother's name appeared just once in a police blotter column, quickly buried. My father aged 10 years in 3 months. My stepmother stopped posting. And still they didn't ask me for help. Pride is expensive. By the time they realized they were out of options, I had already moved past them. The world they thought they controlled no longer needed them. And the girl they dismissed had learned something critical. Luck doesn't announce itself. It waits. By the time my name began appearing in places that mattered, my family had already stopped reading. They were too busy surviving. What the public didn't see, what never made the papers, was how fast things unraveled once the safety net disappeared. The estate my stepmother had bragged about hosting charity galas in sold quietly to cover liquidity gaps. The business my father had sworn would outlive all of us restructured, then downsized, then stripped. My brother tried to outrun the collapse the only way he knew how: risk. Poker tables, crypto schemes, backroom deals pitched as once-in-a-lifetime opportunities. They all ended the same way: loss. But pride kept them silent. No one called me. Not until the invitations stopped. The family gatherings grew smaller, then vanished altogether. Holidays became obligations rather than performances. The long dining table went unused. I knew because I drove past the old house once, unintentionally. The lights were off. A for sale sign leaned crookedly in the yard. I didn't stop. At work, the pace accelerated. What had started as cautious involvement turned into decisive leadership. Deals landed because I didn't chase them. People leaned in because I didn't need to persuade. I had learned something my grandfather understood instinctively. Power speaks softly when it knows it can afford to wait. The man from Switzerland, Adrian, appeared again, this time without warning. He didn't ask for meetings. He joined them. One moment I was negotiating terms with a consortium that had stalled for months. The next, the room shifted when he entered, not because of who he was, but because of how easily he listened. Afterward, he pulled me aside. "You handled that well," he said. "You didn't dominate. You let them reveal their weakness." I shrugged. "They were overextended." "Yes," he said. "But you didn't exploit it. I didn't need to." That made him smile. Our conversations were never personal. Not at first. We talked in margins, in implications, in strategy. He challenged my assumptions. I dismantled his. We disagreed without friction, which I learned was rare. Meanwhile, my family's downfall finally reached the public stage. A small business journal ran a piece on the restructuring of my father's former company. His name appeared once buried under a paragraph about legacy leadership. My brother's debts became visible in court filings, nothing dramatic, just enough to stain. My stepmother gave an interview she thought would frame her as resilient. It didn't. People noticed the absence of substance, the lack of follow-through, the hollow optimism. They noticed the contrast. Because around the same time, another article circulated, not about inheritance, about results. A profile of a quiet investor whose portfolio had stabilized 3 collapsing sectors without public theatrics. My name wasn't front and center, but it was there, correctly spelled. My phone rang that evening. I recognized the number immediately. I let it ring. Then again. I answered on the 3rd call. Yes, silence. Then my father's voice, thin, careful. "Linda," he said, "we need to talk." I didn't correct him for using my name like a request. About what I asked. He hesitated. We didn't realize he began. I closed my eyes. I'm not interested in realizations, I said. I'm interested in outcomes. There was a sharp inhale on the other end. We're struggling, he admitted. Things aren't what we expected. I waited. We thought, after everything, you might help. There it was. Not apology, not accountability, expectation. I already did, I said. How, he asked. By staying out of your way. The silence stretched. You're different now, he said finally. No, I replied. You just see me clearly for the first time. I ended the call. That night, Adrian and I stood on a terrace overlooking a city that had never known my name. Yet. You could have crushed them, he said casually, as if discussing whether. Many would have. They crushed themselves, I answered. He studied me. You don't enjoy it? No, I said. I respect it. The distance between us felt deliberate, measured. Weeks later, he invited me to dinner, not as a meeting, not as business, just dinner. I accepted, not because I was curious, because I was no longer afraid of being seen. The restaurant was understated, no spectacle, no recognition. He didn't talk about the past or the future. He asked me what I wanted, not professionally, personally. I thought about it longer than I should have. I want to build something that doesn't need defending, I said. Something so stable that no one questions why it exists. He nodded. That's rare, he said. Most people want power. You want permanence. Over time, our paths converged naturally. Projects overlapped. Interests aligned. When he challenged me, it was because he expected more, not because he doubted. And when I finally learned the full extent of what my grandfather had arranged, the quiet introductions, the deferred favors, the doors unlocked without announcement, I felt something unexpected. Gratitude, not for the money, for the time. He hadn't made me rich overnight. He had made me ready. Years later, the headlines would change. My family's names appeared less often. Mine appeared more, not as scandal, as standard. They watched from a distance small-town newspapers, muted television segments, seeing me framed as composed, strategic, unremarkable, in the way true power always is. They never contacted me again. And I never reached out. Not out of cruelty, out of clarity. The past doesn't follow you when you stop carrying it. And by the time the world began calling my era golden, I already knew the truth. It wasn't luck, it was timing. And timing, when mastered, looks like destiny. The strange thing about distance is that it sharpens memory. When my family faded into the background of my life, they didn't disappear. They shrank, reduced to fragments, headlines clipped from newspapers, overheard comments at events, a passing mention in a market analysis. I learned more about them from silence than I ever had from conversation. The first real fracture came quietly. A regional paper ran a short piece buried on page 6, former executive files for asset protection. No photos, no quotes, just facts. My father had transferred what little remained of his holdings into a trust too late to matter. The timing alone told the story. Panic, not planning. The markets had turned. Credit tightened. Old relationships stopped answering calls. Legacy only works when it's backed by competence. My brother Daniel lasted longer than I expected. Desperation made him reckless, but also bold. He borrowed from the wrong people, promised returns he couldn't guarantee, and doubled down when retreat would have saved him. The court filings were public. So were the liens. When his name appeared alongside phrases like unsecured debt and default judgment, I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not sadness. Just confirmation. My stepmother tried to pivot. She always did. A lifestyle interview framed her as resilient and misunderstood. She spoke about reinvention, about how wealth was never the point. But her voice lacked conviction. People could tell when someone was mourning relevance rather than loss. Behind the scenes, she sold jewelry quietly, then artwork, then furniture. One by one, symbols of permanence turned into transactions. I didn't intervene. I didn't comment. I didn't need to. Because while they were trying to recover what they thought they deserved, I was building something that didn't require explanation. Adrian and I had stopped pretending our meetings were coincidental. He never hovered, never imposed. But he appeared at critical moments, boardrooms, negotiations, junctions where pressure tested judgment, not as a savior, as a mirror. "You're carrying too much responsibility alone," he said once after a 14-hour negotiation that ended with 3 acquisitions and 1 walked-away deal. "I'm capable," I replied. "That's not the same thing," he said calmly. Capability doesn't mean isolation. That was the first time I hesitated. Because he was right. My grandfather had taught me how to think. Adrian taught me how to delegate without surrendering control. It was a different kind of strength, one that compounded. The empire expanded methodically. No headlines, no theatrics. I focused on infrastructure systems that survived leadership changes, markets that rewarded patience. I refused anything that relied on hype, which is why when a global finance magazine requested a profile, I declined. Twice. They published it anyway. "The Quiet Architect," the headline read. They didn't mention inheritance. They focused on outcomes, on the unusual pattern of stabilization where others had failed. On the way, my decisions favored longevity over short-term applause. My family read it. I know they did. Because the calls started again. Not directly, through intermediaries. A former colleague of my father's, a distant cousin, someone who just wanted to check in. I declined all of them. Until one message slipped through that I didn't expect. "Daniel," no subject line, just a sentence. "I don't need money, I need to talk." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I replied, 1 hour, public place. We met at a cafe far from anywhere either of us used to belong. He looked older, not aged, worn. His confidence had collapsed inward, leaving something quieter behind. He didn't sit immediately, just stood there unsure. "You look well," he said finally. I nodded. "So do you," I replied, "because politeness costs nothing." He laughed bitterly and sat down. "I messed up," he said. "Yes," I agreed. I thought things would turn around. They usually don't when people refuse to change." He winced, then nodded. "I wanted to apologize," he said. "Not for the will, for everything before it." I waited. "For treating you like you were invisible," he continued. "Like you didn't matter unless you were useful." The words sounded rehearsed, but the exhaustion behind them was real. "I don't want anything," he said quickly. "I swear. I just needed to say it." I studied him. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a reckoning. "I accept your apology," I said. "But that doesn't change boundaries." "I know," he said. "I don't expect it to." We sat in silence. Then he asked quietly, "Did you know?" "Back then?" "No," I said. "But I trusted myself." He nodded. "That's the difference," he murmured. When he left, he didn't ask for help. That was how I knew the apology was real. Weeks later, my father wrote me a letter. Handwritten. No return address. It arrived without warning. I read it once, then burned it. Some things don't deserve permanence. My stepmother never reached out. She didn't need to. Her silence was consistent with who she'd always been. Adrian noticed the shift in me before I did. "You're lighter," he said one evening as we reviewed quarterly projections overlooking a city neither of us owned but both influenced. I closed a chapter, I said. Did you? He asked. Yes, I answered, without reopening it. He smiled. That's rare. The final irony revealed itself slowly. A financial analyst published a retrospective on my grandfather's last decade. Buried in the article was a footnote. A mention of a partnership he'd formed years earlier with a rising executive one Adrian had once been mentored by. The dots connected. Not all at once, but enough. I confronted Adrian that night. You knew, I said, before I did. He didn't deny it. I knew of you, he corrected, not about you. Why didn't you tell me? Because if I had, you would have questioned every success, he said gently. You needed to believe it was yours. I exhaled, and now I asked. Now, he said, stepping closer, I know it is. Years passed. Quietly, purposefully. My family's names faded into obscurity. Mine didn't dominate, it endured. When Adrian proposed, it wasn't dramatic. No audience, no announcement. Just a question asked at the right moment by someone who already knew the answer. I said yes. Not because of what we had, but because of how we built it. On our wedding day, no one from my family attended. By design. Not out of spite. Out of respect for the woman I had become. For the life I had earned. And when I looked out at the guests who mattered, I realized something simple and final. Inheritance doesn't determine destiny. Character does. And the people who fail to see your worth early rarely recognize it when it arrives. They only notice when it's too late to reach. 1. The first time I saw my name on the cover of a business magazine, I didn't feel proud. I felt still. The headline wasn't cruel. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't triumphant either. It was factual. From obscurity to influence. How Linda Harrington became one of Europe's most trusted strategic minds. No mention of my family, no mention of the will, no mention of the humiliation, just the work. That was when I knew the story had truly ended. Not because I had won, but because I no longer needed anyone to lose. Years had passed since the funeral, the day my family turned grief into spectacle and me into a punchline. The day they laughed as I held a single plane ticket while cameras flashed and reporters whispered. At the time, I thought that moment would haunt me forever. It didn't. It sharpened me. The empire my grandfather left behind was no longer something I merely inherited. It had become something I understood, expanded, refined. I wasn't just signing documents anymore. I was deciding futures. Entire divisions now reported directly to me logistics, finance, risk assessment. Governments requested consultations. Executives twice my age listened when I spoke, not because of my name, but because I rarely spoke without purpose. I made mistakes, costly ones. But I learned faster than most because failure had never been theoretical to me. It had been personal. The man my grandfather once helped, the one I'd known only as a distant ally in the early years, was now my closest professional equal. Ethan Cole. At first, I didn't know the truth. I thought my early successes were coincidence. Timing. Luck. Every time I faced resistance, regulatory pressure, hostile boards, sudden liquidity gaps, something shifted just in time. A door opened, a vote changed, a phone call arrived before the fall. Only later did Ethan tell me the full story. Years ago, my grandfather had stepped in quietly when Ethan's firm was on the brink of collapse. No publicity, no contracts. Just guidance and a loan that was never meant to be repaid in money. Watch over her, my grandfather had said. Not forever. Just until she knows she doesn't need you. Ethan kept that promise longer than either of them expected. By the time he finally admitted it, I didn't feel betrayed. I felt seen. He didn't stay because he owed my grandfather. He stayed because he respected me. That respect grew into something steadier, deeper, unrushed. We married years later without headlines or ceremony. Just a quiet gathering, a small circle of people who had never underestimated either of us. As for my family, their story unfolded exactly as I knew it would. Money without discipline is a mirror. It doesn't change who you are. It reveals it. My uncle's ventures collapsed within 5 years. Too many shortcuts. Too much confidence. Not enough competence. My aunt sold off assets one by one, mistaking liquidation for strategy. My brother gambled. Not just at tables, but in life. High-risk investments, empty bravado, debts that multiplied faster than apologies. I never intervened. Not out of cruelty, out of clarity. I had learned something they never had. Rescue can be a form of disrespect. They lived quietly now, not destitute but diminished. A modest house in the countryside. Fewer visitors, fewer mirrors. Sometimes I saw them on local news clips standing in the background of economic reports where my name appeared in headlines they pretended not to read. They never contacted me again. And for the first time, that absence felt merciful. One autumn evening, long after the noise had faded, I sat alone on the terrace of our home overlooking the lake. The air was cool, the kind that reminds you life moves forward whether you're ready or not. Ethan joined me with 2 cups of tea. "Do you ever wonder," he asked gently, "what would have happened if they'd treated you differently that day?" I thought about it. If they had shown kindness instead of contempt, curiosity instead of mockery, restraint instead of greed. "Yes," I said, "and I'm grateful they didn't." He raised an eyebrow. "Because if they had," I continued, "I might have spent my life trying to please them instead of becoming myself." That night I wrote a letter, not to them, to no one in particular. It read, "Some people inherit wealth, others inherit lessons. The luckiest ones receive both, just not at the same time." I never published it, but I've carried it with me ever since. If you're listening to this and you've ever been the one overlooked at the table, the one laughed at when the room thought it knew your worth, the one handed scraps while others divided the feast, remember this: not all victories arrive with applause. Some arrive quietly, when you no longer need it. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to reflect on your own journey. Share it with someone who might need to hear it tonight. And if you believe stories can still teach us something about dignity, patience, and quiet strength, stay with us. There are more stories to come. And sometimes the most powerful endings are the ones that don't need revenge to feel complete.